Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to the third lecture of the semester in Bio 104. In today's lecture, we're going to be focusing on graphs. So this lecture is entitled Graphs, Graphs, and More Graphs. Graphing and all these different types of figures that we're going to learn about are extremely important in the field of science. So not only in environmental biology, but as in science as a whole. To understand science, you really do have to understand these different graphs. So graphs are a window into science. Pictured below here, we have all these different trajectories and slopes of different graphs, and you're going to have to know these simple terms as well as other terms that you will focus on in a little bit. So like I just mentioned, graphs are a window into science. When I read a scientific paper, if I'm in a rush, I'm going to read the abstract, which is this little introduction at the top, basically describing what the paper is and what it found in a really brief statement. And then I read a bit of the introduction if I want to know a little bit more, then the abstract, and then I go right to the figures. You can skip a ton of text by just understanding what the figures are depicting. So somebody in a specific discipline of science can understand what new developments are occurring in that discipline by keeping up to date with new publications, by looking at the graphs of those papers, of those publications on a day-to-day basis. So here we have these two red terms, data versus datum. When you refer to, when you look at a graph and see all these little points, so let's take a look at the scatter plot to the top right. You refer to all these points as data, right? So data is plural. If you were to point out at one of these points, you would call that particular point datum. So datum is singular, data is plural. We should know next that the independent variable affects change in the dependent variable. The figure on the bottom left, we have plant height as a function of year. This is a perfect example of describing the independent versus dependent variable. So an independent variable does not change regardless of any other factor. So an independent variable is on the x-axis, which is on the bottom here. So this is the x-axis, this is the y-axis. The independent variable here is time. Time continues regardless of how this plant is growing, right? So the independent variable, a really good example of an independent variable is time. Now the dependent variable on the y-axis, and the y-axis is always going to have the dependent variable. This makes sense. You have to look at a figure and say, oh wow, height depends on time, right? The average height of this tree individual depends on time. The longer this tree is living through time, the taller its height gets, right? So we have the dependent variable, right? And I always tell my students to just look at the figure and say this sentence. You find out what the y-axis is labeled as. So average height as a function of year, right? So say that sentence, complete that sentence. Once you do that, you'll understand what the actual graph is depicting. So average height as a function of year, right? Again, x-axis, y-axis. The x-axis is the independent variable. The y-axis is the dependent variable. The next thing about graphs we're going to learn about is categorical versus continuous data. So categorical data, like its name suggests, is comprised of different categories. So a great example of categorical data are graphs that are pie graphs. So a pie graph is a great example of categorical data, and one way to distinguish categorical data from continuous data is if you can see a figure and actually jumble the data around. So it doesn't matter where. So this pie graph was data taken from a class, and these students wrote down their favorite pops, right? Their favorite soft drinks. It doesn't matter that Coke Classic is in this region. See, I can move this section over here. I can move Diet Coke over here. I can move Sprite over here. So a dead giveaway that it's categorical data is if you can move the data around without actually altering the data or the meaning behind the figure. So that is a great example of categorical data. Now, this histogram or bar graph underneath is also categorical data. Now, it makes sense that the figure is set up like this. So the title of this figure is Ages of Women Visiting the Library. I know it is a kind of a bizarre data set, but we have frequency as a function of age, right? So we have 12 individuals from ages 60 to 70 that visit the library. So this age group visits the library the most, and it makes sense to the viewer that the age values are set up like this. But guess what? We can jumble these data around, and it wouldn't be, it would kind of make these data in this figure a little more cryptic to see, but it wouldn't change anything. So we can actually change this figure and have the most frequent visitors, the age group with the most frequent visitors, all the way over here. We would just have to have the x-axis change to make sure that the viewer knows that the 70 to 60 age-year-old women visit the library the most. So we can actually change it and have different a different position of these categories, or we like to call these bins, right? Because individuals in this bin are comprised of the highest frequent visitors to the library. So we can actually change the histogram around, alter the x-axis, and the data wouldn't change, and you would still know that this age group visits the library the best. So not as easy to see that this pie graph is categorical, but this histogram is also categorical. Each one of these age bins is a different category, and you could actually jumble this histogram around and still keep the integrity of the data. These data, excuse me. A great example of a continuous data plot is this figure to the right. So there is a lot going on here. I probably should have started off with a more simple figure, but I really do like the three-dimensional characteristic of these data. So here we have a drill bit, and we have the speed of a drill bit and the diameter of the drill bit. So I'm sure you all have used a drill before. As you continue to use a drill, the friction of the metal drill and whatever it's coming into contact with, the friction actually causes the temperature to rise. So looking at this figure, if we just look at one x-axis at a time, because we have one y-axis in temperature and we actually have two x-axes. So we'll call speed x1 and drill diameter x2. So clearly, as the speed of the drill increases, the temperature of the drill also increases, right? Increased speed, these are rotations per second, maybe minute, I don't exactly know, but as you increase the RPM, the temperature of the drill also increases. Now, similarly, we take a look at X2. As the drill bit diameter gets larger, there is a larger surface area coming into contact with the surface, and there is more friction, so there is more heat. So the larger the drill diameter, the hotter the temperature gets. A dead giveaway that you are looking at continuous data is if you can take a look at the y-axis and do this little thought experiment. Say to yourself, can the drill diameter get larger than 5.1 millimeters? Can the drill diameter get larger than this? And yes, it can. So it can actually continue off of the actual graph that we're looking at, and we can hypothesize, we can make an educated guess that as you continue to increase the diameter, even past what this graph is showing, the temperature will maintain this positive direction and trajectory, right? So as the drill diameter exceeds what we actually see on the graph, we can still hypothesize that the graph will continue going on, right? Continue, the key word, and continue its trajectory. Same thing with speed. Let's take a look at X1. We get a more expensive drill that can spin faster. We can fathom that there are RPMs past what the graph is depicting, and we can hypothesize that the temperature will increase. So by understanding this figure, we can actually use the two axes, the two x-axes, X1 and X2, and have a really good understanding of what the temperature of the drill bit will be depending on both the drill diameter and drill speed. So let's just say we have a drill diameter of 5.1 millimeters. We can figure out that a drill that is 5.1 millimeters at at the speed of 353 RPMs, the temperature, right, is going to be somewhere along here, right? It's going to be 39 degrees Celsius, right? However, if we have that 5.1 millimeter drill and we actually start to spin that drill at 687 RPMs, we know that that temperature of the drill is going to be 41.6 degrees Celsius. All of these drill diameters and drill speeds and how they interact with temperature. So all of these data make up this figure. And it's actually a lot of information. I really like to use this figure because of its extra dimension using another x-axis. So I'm going to go through some different figures and some different terminology with figures. Scatter plots are extremely important and useful in biological sciences. I see scatter plots all the time. A datum that does not really fit the data set is known as an outlier, right? It's outside of the data set. And it is common practice to actually exclude an outlier from your data analysis, because this single point, it could actually throw off your final equations. So it is common practice to exclude 1, 2, maybe 3 outliers from your data set to make your final equations fit your graph much better. Some reasons for outliers could just be like a random anomaly. It could be user error, because humans carry out science and humans are imperfect. So we kind of accepted the fact that, sometimes equipment might fail that's recording information. So it's common practice to actually exclude some outliers. Line graphs are useful, especially with like plant growth. So I commonly see line graphs in botanical sciences. So we have growth as a function of time. Clearly the plant is going to be growing as time progresses, given enough nutrients, light, and water. Histogram or bar graph. I already saw this figure. We should know that a bar graph is also known as a histogram. These are really cool graphs that are used commonly in ecology. They're called box and whiskers. So there's a lot of information within a single datum in box and whisker plots. So all this information is held within a single box and whisker. We have the lowest value, we have the highest value, we have a median, the first quartile and the third quartile. So I'm going to actually get to a box and whisker graph in today's lecture, and you'll fully understand it after I use the example in this lecture. So the general trajectory or slope of graphs you have to know. You can see now you have to imagine the y-axis and the x-axis, and this is a positive slope because as the x-axis increases, the slope actually increases, right? So it's actually going uphill. So we refer to this line being a positive slope. We're never really going to see an undefined slope in here. So I just want you to know that, we're not going to see this a lot. X is not changing, so therefore it is an undefined slope. We have a negative slope, so as the x-axis increases, the data actually has this negative slope. It's actually going downhill, right? So as the x-axis increases, the y decreases. That's why it is a negative slope. Here, x increases, y increases. Here, x increases, y decreases. It goes down. And then a slope of 0 as x increases, as the I'm blanking. as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable stays the same. So as the independent variable, the x-axis increases, the dependent variable stays the same. So therefore it is a slope of 0. So we know that these figures do not always have straight lines. The ones that do have a straight line, whether they're increasing at a constant rate or decreasing at a constant rate, and these are pictured on the right. So we have a clearly defined negative slope and a positive slope. They are decreasing at a constant rate and increasing at a constant rate. Now, obviously, not all figures have this constant slope. Let's start all the way to the left now. This figure, it is decreasing, right? You can see that it's a negative slope, right? It's decreasing at a decreasing rate. So you can actually see in the beginning, it decreases rapidly, but then it decreases less and less rapidly. So it's decreasing at a decreasing rate, right? This figure is decreasing at an increasing rate. So it is clearly decreasing the whole time, but in the beginning it's only decreasing a little bit. However, as the x-axis continues, it starts to decrease at an increasing rate. So it decreases at a faster rate the further along the x-axis you get. So we have decreasing at a decreasing rate and decreasing at an increasing rate. Two totally different trajectories, right? Two totally different slopes. So this figure, increasing at an increasing rate, also known as an exponential figure. It is increasing. It's increasing the entire time, but it's not increasing that fast in the beginning. And then as the x-axis increases still, you get this sharp incline, right? So it's increasing at an increasing rate. Next, we have increasing at a decreasing rate. So you guys should be able to look at these figures and already, like, very quickly be, if I ask, is this a negative or a positive slope? You should very quickly answer that. So this is a negative, this is a positive, this is a positive, this is a negative, this is a negative, this is a positive, right? Is it going up with is the y-axis going up with the x-axis, or is it going down with the x-axis? So you should know the general slope, and additionally you should know these specific shapes of the curve, right? So this one is increasing rapidly in the beginning, and then it still increases, but not at that quick of a rate, right? So it's increasing at a decreasing rate. I just taught you this term, exponential, right? This is an exponential growth pattern. And in ecology, you do see populations grow exponentially in the beginning. So for example, and this will lead us into logistic growth. Let's say you have a pond in your backyard, pretty huge pond, and you release 4 fast reproducing fish, and you just every day just put a decent amount of food, like a lot of food, let's just say like 6 pounds of food a day for these 4 fish. Now they're fast reproducing, there is ample space, there is ample food, So they're actually going to reproduce really fast in the beginning when there's all this extra food and extra space. Now, after 4 years, you're going to see a growth pattern that looks like this logistic growth. And there's this very important dotted line that we're seeing here, and it's called carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is how many individuals a system can support. So you're not adding more food than you were in the beginning. You keep adding the same amount of food to this pond, and after 4 years you have this exponential growth, but then the same amount of food has to feed all these new individuals, and the population size, it still increases, but it starts to increase at a decreasing rate. So logistic growth curve is this S shape, this sigmoidal curve growth pattern. It increases at an increasing rate in the beginning, and then as the population approaches carrying capacity, it actually starts to increase at a decreasing rate, right? So I'm going to show you something a little bit more in depth that has to do with this logistic growth pattern. So I am actually going to draw something that depicts this logistic growth pattern, but it's something that it's a pattern that's more realistic. So I am actually going to draw something that depicts this logistic growth pattern, but it's something that it's a pattern that's more realistic. So we have the x-axis, right? And the y-axis. Again, the y is the dependent variable. The x is independent. So the x is going to be time, and I like to put in parentheses the more specific value. So time is pretty broad. What are we talking? Seconds, minutes? I'm going to be talking about years. Time in years. And the y-axis is going to be population number. And I'm in parentheses, I'm going to say hundreds. Right? So that is what I want my axes. We have the y, we have the x. And through time, these fish, because there's all this food, they increase at an increasing rate. And as they reach carrying capacity, because again, you're only putting in that much food, there's only so much food, this slope starts to still increase, but at a decreasing rate. So this is what we're seeing on the screen, but if we were to extend this x-axis, right, and this is what we see in nature, it doesn't just stop at carrying capacity. What actually happens, I'm going to erase this a little bit. What actually happens, it decreases at a decreasing rate, but it actually goes past carrying capacity, right? And guess what happens once a population surpasses carrying capacity? There's competition, right? And not all individuals make it. So what you actually see in nature is this oscillation around carrying capacity. Now, obviously, even though this is more dynamic than the first figure you looked at, Obviously, there's all these external influences that will even make this figure even more messy, especially abiotic factors such as sunlight and temperature. Just randomly, it could be a cold year, which will reduce population, or maybe it's too hot, that will also reduce population. The amount of predators, that's a biotic interaction, right? So even though this is already more dynamic, this will vary year to year in a natural setting. So next, I'm going to introduce these two red terms, interpolate versus extrapolate. Interpolate versus extrapolate. And these are very important terms, especially in these scientific disciplines. So they both have to do with observing and looking at information on a graph. So to extrapolate data, the word extra is in it. So we have to go beyond the data set. So like I was saying about continuous data, how continuous data will continue off of the data set, that is actually similar to extrapolating data. So extrapolating data from this specific figure would be for a researcher to not test a drill diameter within this data set, but beyond it. So let's say somebody who's studying friction, who's studying these drills and the temperature that coincides with different speeds and different drill diameters, wants to hypothesize what temperature a drill bit will be if it's a drill diameter of just 6 millimeters. So they can hypothesize, they can take this trend and put it past where the actual data was collected and hypothesize what the temperature of the drill bit will be if it's this diameter that wasn't recorded in this study, right? So that's extrapolation. Extrapolation is always, and I repeat, always weaker, statistically weaker than interpolating data. So these values of drill diameters were actually tested in this study. But let's say that same researcher wants to find out what a drill diameter of just 4 centimeters, what temperature that drill diameter would reach at 4 centimeters. Even though the researchers that put this figure together didn't actually test the temperature of a 4 millimeter wide drill, we can readily hypothesize. We can interpolate these data and come out with a value that is much more reliable than extrapolating data. So interpolating, the prefix inter, so inside this data, extra outside this data, right? Researchers will always favor interpolating data. Interpolating data is much more statistically powerful than extrapolating data, right? Because who knows what happened, who knows what's going to happen with a drill diameter past 5.1 millimeters, right? It's possible that it gets too hot and the metal will denature, right? And the temperature will skyrocket, right? It's possible. it's outside of the data set. There's a lot more uncertainty. Interpolating data, however, you know it's going to lie in between two values that you actually tested. Interpolating data is much stronger. So this figure actually shows that in the future, if everything remains the same, if humans continue to populate the earth like we are doing, we're going to have upwards of 11, 12 billion people by 2050, right? However, if fertility goes down, if the average person has fewer offspring than the average person has now, you're looking at a population of around 8 billion by 2050. So even though it looks like these data are within this data set, these are just possible outcomes. The real data, if you remember, this figure was created in 2011, 2012. This data stops right there. So this is extrapolated data, right? And this proves my point. There is a lot of uncertainty with extrapolating data. Extrapolating data can be quite variable, right? You're looking at a difference of 4 billion people, right? From 8 all the way to 12 billion people, right? That's wild. 4 billion people is a ridiculous amount of people. Now, let's just say these data came from a census taken every 10 years. So every 10 years, every country counts their humans. Every country counts the number of citizens they have. I mean, this is hypothetical, right? There are, censuses are taken yearly in many places, but let's just say for our purposes that a census is taken every 10 years. Now, opposite of extrapolating data, one can say, even though they only took data from 1970 and 1980, what was the population in 1975? And you could hit right on this line. It looks pretty much exact that in 1975, global population was 4 billion, right? So even though, and this is hypothetical, even though these researchers didn't take data in 1975, we know a very close approximation of human population, and we can thank the statistical power of interpolating data. Extrapolating data, very variable, right? Extremely variable. Again, another common theme that we're seeing in this course is fertility. So in less developed countries, women have a higher fertility rate. The more developed regions of the world, women have a lower fertility rate. So fertility is the number of children per woman. In the least developed countries, in the 50s, you're looking at almost an average of 7. A woman would bear nearly 7 children. And this is for several reasons. Socioeconomically, people in least developed countries, they are going to work in more rural areas. They're going to be farming. They need manpower to actually work fields. Additionally, in least developed countries, infant mortality is really high. Child mortality is high. So to ensure that you actually have children that make it to adulthood, you actually had to produce a lot more children than places that were more developed. So some underlying themes that we're seeing here that have to do with a lot of socioeconomic interactions. Again, we're going to tie these together with our environment. This is a nice segue. We have per capita income in different regions. Again, we have the y-axis, right? Per capita income in thousands of dollars. I like how this figure, it says per capita income, but in parentheses, you know specifically how much the figure is depicting. And then we have the x-axis. We have year and the dates, right? And North America and Europe are have been, developed for quite some time, and that's why their GDP per capita is much higher than the rest of the world. East Asia and the Pacific. Central Asia is not up here. That'd be interesting to see. China's rise as their economy really has grown in the past 50 years. But we have these less developed regions in red, green, and purple: East Asia and the Pacific, Middle East and North Africa, and then South Asia. So there is a lot going on with this figure. It has actually two y-axes. So we looked at a figure with two x-axes, and because there's a lot going on, it's important for us to actually understand what information goes with what axes. So the growth percentage or number of children are these two lines, right? So we have this yellow line being the population growth in percentage, and then the red line is the children per woman, or fertility rate of women through time, right, as a function of time. The Y2 axis is GDP, and they are made up of this histogram, right? So these data have to do with Y2, these data have to do with Y1. There is what the authors of this figure are trying to show is that as GDP increased in Brazil through time, fertility rates decreased, and the population growth, the percentage of population growth also decreased. So as the per capita GDP increases, as people get more money because there's more development, because there's more jobs, there's more security, there's more infrastructure, there's better health care, and with that, women don't have to produce more than 5 children to ensure they get enough food to eat, to ensure that the women ensure that their children reach adulthood, right? Because infant mortality and child mortality will decrease. There's no need to procreate at this rate. In more modern times, you have females in Brazil that are reproducing at similar rates to North America, right? US and Canada. I don't know what Mexico's fertility rate is, but I do know that the USA is around 2, probably like 1.5 children per woman. Here is another histogram, and I'm going to use a more ecological example to explain this histogram. You guys know I like to study fungi. Here are these pine beetles. So I'm sure you guys have flipped over a log before and saw tiny holes, and you might not have known what those holes were caused by, but in many cases they're caused by these beetles. Beetles are the most diverse group of animals on the planet. There is a just ridiculous number of beetles around the world. All of the beetles, and they're from the order Coleoptera. All of the beetles in the world actually make up 25% of all the animals living on the planet today. So this group is extremely successful. You find beetles all around the world. Many have evolved really interesting interactions with their environment. These specific beetles are known as pine beetles. There are thousands of types of pine beetles. And what they do is they actually bore into pine trees, and they lay their eggs, and they excavate these little galleries right underneath the bark of pine trees. They excavate these little rooms. They lay their eggs hatch into larvae, and a really interesting thing happens. So on the head of these beetles, they have these structures called micrangia. And micrangia, if you zoom in with a scanning electron microscope, you see these sunken pits on their head, and there are these tiny little structures. These are not bacteria. These are actually fungal spores. So as the beetle bores into pine trees, they go in head first, and spores that are nestled within their micrangia are knocked off within the tree, and these fungi, these spores germinate, and a really amazing thing happens. The galleries that these pine beetles excavated becomes colonized by the fungi that they transported via their micrangia. Now the fungus spreads throughout this inner layer underneath the bark of these pine trees, and the larvae actually eat this fungus. Now there have been a ton of studies on pine boring beetles, and many times researchers found that the fungus benefits the larvae greatly. That without the fungus, these larvae would have a harder time maturing and reaching adulthood. So the fungus is beneficial. It makes sense that micrangia, that this structure on these specific beetles has evolved, right? Because if the spread of fungal spores increases the success of their offspring, then beetles that do have micrangia are going to be, this trait is going to be passed on for generations. Now, contrary to the interaction that I just talked about, I read this recent study that focused on this specific pine beetle that's native to North America. Now, it has invaded parts of China, and it has laid to waste millions and millions of Chinese pine trees. Now, in these pine trees, they found the galleries that these pine beetles created, and they cultivated the fungus that were on the micrangium of these invasive beetles. They actually found that 3 of the 7 species of fungus found on micrangia actually decreased the mean weight change of the developing larvae. So the larvae, that the offspring of these pine beetles, actually did better without these 3 species of fungus, revealing that sometimes fungi that do get transported on the mycangia of these pine beetles are actually not good. They're not mutualists of the pine beetle. They actually decrease the fitness, right? They decrease the fitness of their offspring. So that was really cool. That was a really cool study. And, I like learning about stuff like this, and I thought it was a good time to bring up this histogram because we are learning about graphs. Now, this is that box and whisker plot that I mentioned earlier. So each and one of these datum are a box and whisker, and this German study shook up the entomological world. So entomology is the study of insects. In this German study, they showed that in just 27 years, there's been a 75% reduction in total flying insect biomass, right? A 75% reduction in the actual in the amount of insects throughout these different ecosystems in Germany, right? So that's really crazy. Now, it makes sense why they use box and whisker. It's because each one of these datum is actually the data from an entire year. So for an entire year, they set up these nets to collect all these insects from across different ecosystems across Germany, and at the end of the year they would compile these data into a single box and whisker datum, right? So there's a ton of information on the screen. So for example, in this year, right, the minimum number of insects for a day was just over 0.1 grams per day, whereas the most abundant biomass per day for this single year was around 5 grams, right? So you can see the minimum, you can see the maximum, and then the really important part is the median, right? The average of the year when it comes to insect biomass. And you can see this negative line, right? You can see this negative slope. Now, another really important thing about this figure, right? I explained that there's been a 75% reduction in total flying insect biomass across Germany in just 27 years. This doesn't look that negative. I mean, when you see 75% reduction, you would think the line would be like super negative, right? It's definitely negative, but it's just not that drastic. Until, I repeat, until you actually look at the y-axis. So this is why it's so important to look at your axes before you totally take a look at the entire graph. So you have to really look at the axes. So this axis actually, the values actually double, right? It's not a regular, it doesn't increase at a constant rate. What this is a term, and I want you to write this down. It has been log transformed, right? So the y-axis has been log transformed. And why do they do this? Well, I'll show you. It would look like this, right? Something like that. That is hard to decipher, especially when you realize that figures are broadcasted on the internet and in physical papers, right? this does not fit on a screen good. It does not fit on paper good. So what do? You log transform the x-axis. You change the layout so it fits better, right? So now we can have 0.1 and 20 right here. You have to know that the axis has been log transformed, and you can fit more information on a smaller scale, right? But a negative thing is that the line, right, these data don't look as drastic, right? Because it's been log transformed, the line doesn't look as negative as what these data actually depict. So we've looked at histograms that kind of go up from the x-axis, but now we kind of have the x-axis in the middle and the y-axis on the bottom, right? So it's oriented differently, and that's why you have this shape here. And there are 3 different patterns that we're seeing in front of us with these age class histograms. We have all the way to the left is a rapidly growing population. In the middle is a constant or steady population, and on the right we have a declining population. So the most important thing when you're looking at an age class histogram are the early age groups. So the purple region of these figures, right, from 20 years all the way to newborns, this is what you're really looking at, right? In a constant, stable population, right? In a stable population like what we see in Sweden, the young population is very similar to the middle and older age classes, right? So what this is showing is that, these individuals, these reproductive individuals, are just going to replace themselves. So they'll die, but there's a comparable number of younger people that will mature later on. So this is a stable age class histogram. If we go to the left, in the country of Niger in Africa, we have a totally different looking shape, very pyramid-like, and you could see that this population, right, the youth is drastically larger than the middle and later age classes, when the younger age classes are that much larger than older age classes. Obviously, eventually, they will mature and they will start to reproduce. So this part of the world is going through a rapidly growing population, right? All the way to the right, we have Singapore. This is a declining population. So there are fewer younger individuals than this middle class, right? So this middle class is actually not even replacing themselves. There are fewer numbers of the youth age groups compared to the middle age groups. So eventually the population is steadily declining. Again, a quick refresher. Is this continuous data or is this categorical data? So this is categorical data. You can move all of these countries. So these data, we have the total fertility. So on the left, we have education, and on the right we have fertility. So what this figure is trying to represent is that as schools, as secondary school rates, as enrollment of secondary school for women increase, their fertility rate decreases, right? So in places like Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Guatemala, and in parts of Kenya, female secondary school enrollment is down, and that actually correlates to many socioeconomic things, but ultimately their fertility rate is higher. So it's not as simple as, women in these countries, because they don't go to school, their fertility rate is high. It's much more complex than that, but this is what the author of these two figures was trying to get at, that places that are less developed, they are not too worried about women going to secondary schools. There's not a lot of infrastructure. So child mortality and infant mortality is really high. Families have to reproduce enough children so they can help work the land, etc. Right? There's many socioeconomic interactions going on, but what this figure is trying to get at is as places on Earth become more stabilized with, as governments increase infrastructure and job opportunities, and eventually the ability for women to go to secondary schools, their fertility rate too will go down. But this is categorical data, right? You can just jumble up all these countries, and what the author is trying to depict wouldn't be as clear, right? Because he obviously did this for a reason. But this does show that you can jumble up these data, and it would still maintain the integrity of the data. It would be harder to decipher, but it does show that it is categorical data. Another thing about scatter plots we should learn about is this linear regression. So this is an equation that is the best fit to these data, and with that equation you can manipulate your data and learn even more. Again, we talked about outliers, so it's possible that these 6 outliers might change the actual equation of this linear regression, and in biology many times you can remove some outliers. What is this trend? You should be able to look at a scatter plot, and especially if there is a trend line, you should be able to easily tell that this is a negative slope, right? So as the human development index increases, right? Human development index is basically, how much infrastructure a country has, and how many jobs, and basically how much money. It's all these factors, but basically for just a quick description, countries that have a high human index are going to be have more infrastructure, more money per capita, and with that there is fewer child deaths, right? So again, these underlying themes that we keep seeing. For human population growth, I do like this figure a lot. I would like you to be able to explain the trajectory, right? So it increases at an increasing rate, right? But then it starts to increase at a decreasing rate. So I want you to be able to explain its shape, right? Think about a logarithmic curve. Now, human population, this is just a figure that I found. I've seen several human population growth figures. Many of them look straight up exponential. This one looks a little bit more logarithmic, right? So are humans reaching carrying capacity? Is there a limit to how many humans can survive on this planet? Well, certainly there must be some type of limit, right? There are finite resources. There are resources that we depend on that are not in, infinite abundance. So I want you to think about that, and this preludes next week's lecture. I'm going to get into the study of agronomy and agriculture and the Green Revolution. So I'm really excited about that. I hope that you guys enjoyed this lecture. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you guys on the next video. Maintain your health, both mental and physical, and keep up the good work. Stay disciplined, and I will catch up with you next time.